On behalf of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom and its regional director, Jules Martin, I would like to welcome former leader of the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, and its predecessor, the Democratic Party, and tonight's speaker, Tony Leon, members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of the Judiciary, members of Parliament, councillors, and I think a special welcome to former public representatives, office bearers and staff members from both the Democratic Party and the Democratic Alliance who worked with Tony Leon over many years. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the joint Friedrich Naumann Foundation and Institute of Race Relations second annual Liberty Lecture. It's lovely to see so many people here. There are a few chairs in the front for those at the back. Of course, we'd like to think this is all due to the organizers, but we can't quite say that it is. It's definitely a tribute, and I think a fine one at that, to our speaker, whom we are very lucky to have tonight, Tony Leon. My name is Cecilia Koch, and I am the Head of Research and Advocacy Projects at the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom, and I work with the Institute of Race Relations, South Africa's oldest think tank, established in 1929. The aim of this annual event lies at the very heart of the work of both the FNF and the IRR, and that is to contribute to the strengthening of liberal democracy in South Africa. I would now like to call on the Regional Director for Sub-Saharan Africa of the Naumann Foundation, Jules Martin, for a few opening remarks. And for those of you who don't know Jules, in former incarnations he was a member of the European Parliament for the Netherlands and Secretary General of the World Union of Liberal Parties, Liberal International. Jules.
Thank you, and good evening. Standing here as a foreigner, as a guest in your country, I was of course wondering, is there anything that I can possibly say about our speaker this evening that you do not already know? And I think there is. In the 1990s, when I was with Liberal International, that was a time when the World Union of Liberal Parties was theoretically a world union. We had two parties that weren't European, the Canadians and the South Africans. And it was mostly, not entirely, but mostly a meeting of venerable, middle-aged and elderly men who represented mostly very small liberal parties from across the globe. That has, of course, all changed by now. Liberal International now has a South African at the helm, Gordon McKay, and Europe is awash with liberal prime ministers, so everything has changed. But in those days, that was the case very much. And what was striking about a lot of these liberal parties is that it seemed to be that they were completely reconciled with the fact that they would never win elections. After all, liberalism is much too complicated to explain to ordinary voters. And the main aim seemed to be to gain respect. To gain respect, especially from your opponents. That was very important. That after an election they would say, well, yeah, they lost heavily, but they're very good people. And then they were really proud. You know, we've shown the flag, and we're tiny and minuscule, we have no influence whatsoever, but, you know, but we are the true liberals. And then one happy day, suddenly from South Africa, Tony Leon arrived with a very different approach. I know, I mean, we've spoken about this and we remember it slightly differently. I think he short sells himself in his version of the story, and I like my own version better. So he arrived there and was completely different. You got the impression that, you know, if your opponents respect you, then you are really a bunch of losers. You know, what you want is for your opponents to detest you, to hate you, to think you're absolutely awful, and to fear you. And I think that actually had a lot of influence on a lot of people there. It certainly had on me. and on other people as well. And I think some people actually still talk about this. How as liberals, actually you have to cut away from what we did in those days. Of course, that's all over those days, but in those days liberals mainly fought each other rather than the real enemy. But we wanted to show who the real liberal was, so we would fight one another. As I said, those days are over, of course. But he said, no, let's look outside. He had one great ally, or someone who saw Tony as a great ally, and that was the president of Liberal International in those days, the well-known German liberal Otto Graf Lambsdorff. And he very much saw this as a partnership. It's something that we had to move forward in. And I think it fits so well with the whole concept of a liberty lecture. It fits in our concept of it as FNF. I'm very sure that it fits in the concept that IRR, the Institute of Race Relation, has of what these lectures should be about. They should challenge, they should make you think, preferably they should make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And this I'm very sure Tony will be able to do. I know a little bit what he might be saying, and I'm very excited about this lecture this evening. I think it will give us all a lot. It will give liberals a lot to think about, but it will give everybody in this country, and I think in the whole liberal movement as a whole, a lot to think about. So I wish you a very nice evening. I know his speech. I will not tell you how it ends, so we keep that for you to discover. And I look forward to spending this wonderful evening with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jules. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to this evening's speaker, Tony Leon. Tony is an award-winning author, speaker, and consultant, and has had 2 successful careers in both frontline South African politics and international diplomacy. Currently the chairman of Resolve Communications, he also consults to business in South America and South Africa, writes a column for South Africa's Business Day, and speaks to various international and local audiences. For nearly 20 years, Tony Leon was a member of Parliament in South Africa, and for 13 years he led the Democratic Alliance. He is the longest-serving leader of the opposition in Parliament since the advent of democracy in 1994. And a trained lawyer, Tony actively participated in the constitutional negotiations that led to the birth of a democratic South Africa. In this country, Tony led and grew his party from its marginal position on the brink of political extinction into the second largest political force. Internationally, Tony was the Vice President of Liberal International and has addressed international fora from the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington and New York and the Royal Institute for International Affairs in London to the German Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, the European Parliament in Brussels, and the World Economic Forum, Oxford Union, and Yale Political Union. Tony has been widely published in academic journals and has authored for, amongst others, Time Magazine, The Spectator, Harvard International Review, The Washington Post, The Washington Times, Financial Times, The Sydney Morning Herald, The Daily Telegraph, and The New Statesman. After standing down from the leadership of the opposition in 2007, he was awarded a fellowship at the Institute of Politics John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and at the Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Tony also served as the South African ambassador to Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, appointed by President Jacob Zuma from 2009 to 2012. He has also published 4 books to much critical acclaim: Hope and Fear, Reflections of a Democrat, On the Contrary, Leading the Opposition in a Democratic South Africa, which won the Recht Milan Prize for Nonfiction that year, The Accidental Ambassador, and opposite Mandela, encounters with South Africa's icon. Nelson Mandela said of Tony Leon on his retirement from political leadership, "Your contribution to democracy is enormous. You have more support for all you have done than you might ever read about." Ladies and gentlemen, the inimitable Tony Leon.
Thank you very much, Cecilia and Jules. I need to make a bit of a confession here. Cecilia is a very good personal friend of mine, probably accounts for the warm introduction. And Jules and I go back a long way, so it's a lot of you. Well, you know, you mentioned I was in Parliament for 20 years. There's a table over there, start with my great comrade Douglas Gibson, and looking at Ansh Andrea and Claire and David Quayle and the indomitable Jill Wenzel and Mari Roth. And I have to say that, you know, it wasn't me. And I don't want to, this is a liberal lecture, talk about the Dread Collective, but a lot of the biography you described was indeed a collective effort. So I just want to mention that, because so many members of the collective, if one can say this, twice in the opening paragraph of two such impeccably liberal organizations, are in fact responsible for that which you mentioned in the bio. So thank you very much for the invitation to deliver this Liberty Lecture of 2019 on a subject very close to my heart. And just before you fall asleep, let me remind you what the title I set, An Imperfect Fit, South Africa and the Need for a Liberal Party. And tonight's event is co-sponsored by two organizations with whom I closely collaborated during over 25 years in South African politics, and whose work, as we used to say, I'm a detribalized attorney in law, jointly and severally, add both rigor and worth to the public debate in this country. To summarize my conclusion up front to the topic which I posed, I think the need for a liberal party armed with courage, clarity, self-confidence, vision, and purpose is needed now at this time of demoralization and national peril in our country, more than it has ever been needed. In this regard, although not political parties, the sponsors of tonight's lecture have been at the forefront of advancing liberalism in our country for a very long time indeed. The South African Institute of Race Relations has been at the helm of critical engagement in South Africa since its founding 90 years ago in 1929. May it continue to practice the long obedience. That phrase, incidentally, was first brought to my attention by my predecessor as leader of the Democratic Party, the late Dr. Zach de Beer. He reminded us newcomer members of Parliament in 1989, if you can believe such a fact, that the worth of a worldview was encapsulated by Nietzsche. And he suggested that this was the guiding star for South Africa's liberals. There should be a long obedience in the same direction. Thereby results, and has always resulted in the long run, something that has made life worth living. Both as encomium to the work and validity of the SA Institute of Race Relations, this is apt. It is also a useful marker, let me add, for my address this evening on the imperfect fit and the need for a liberal party in South Africa. With the co-hosts of tonight's lecture, personified by Jules and Cecilia, with us, I enjoyed a really close relationship and political collaboration until I stood down as leader of the DA in 2007. Politicians never know when to quit, so I just decided to jump before I got pushed, let me say. And one of the thing about the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung is one of the very few non-governmental organizations in this country that was prepared to publicly and usefully assist the official opposition. And it might be no exaggeration to say, as per another veteran liberal, Robin Carlyle's remark in another context, that South Africa liberalism could well have died of malnutrition were it not for the nurturing of the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. And I need to add here, and Jules mentioned one of them, two very big personalities from Liberal International and the Foundation, who provided so much value and so much encouragement to the work we were involved in on, I have to say, then is now very stony southern soil, to try and allow South African liberalism to replenish its roots after the advent of full-blown democracy here in 1994. The first of these, as Jules mentioned, was the late great Otto Graf Lambsdorff, a close friend and staunch political ally. He served with distinction as president of Liberal International, as the chairman or leader of the Free Democrat Party in Germany, and before that as the Federal Minister of Economics. He gave very useful advice on the need for muscular liberalism and reminded us often that the departure point for a liberal view on the political economy was as much market as possible and as much state as is necessary. Another figure from those times, and a political colleague of Jules, was the president of Liberal International in 1994, the year that I became the leader of the Democratic Party in South Africa. Fritz Balkenstein, well, this is actually where, of course, you know, politicians plagiarize. They hear a good idea, they borrow it, and they present it as their own. Fritz Balkenstein, the Dutch liberal politician, told our very small parliamentary caucus, consisting of Douglas Gibson, me, and 5 others at the time, that the problem with liberal politicians in that era was they spent far too much time trying to win the affection of their opponents and not enough time trying to win the allegiance of their voters. And I wrote that down in the back of my diary, and with very imperfect results, we proceeded to try and apply both those maxims. I want to start tonight by telling you the story of 2 residences. The first of these is very close to here, or relatively, in Brintirian in Pretoria. It is the official home of our president and served for decades to house various heads of state of South Africa. I first visited it in the early 1990s, when paradoxically its name was Libertas, after the Roman goddess of liberty. I could not help thinking at the time of the crowning irony of a name chosen for this grand Cape Dutch sentinel, that this was a home to a succession of segregationist and apartheid leaders who had denied the essence of liberty to the bulk of their citizens. But of course, the last residence under that title, although a nationalist, F.W. de Klerk, did some remarkably liberal things to advance freedom and turn his and the country's back on the grim path forged by all of his predecessors. The last occasion I visited the same residence in late 2012, let me in full confessional mode advise, was to see Jacob Zuma, the president who had appointed me as ambassador to Argentina, not incidentally green-lighted by the Guptas, from which post I had just returned. By then, the name emblazoned on the gates of his presidential home, in lieu of Libertas, was Mhlamba Ndlovu, which from the Shangaan language translates as New Dawn. That would become, of course, the winning slogan of his successor, Cyril Ramaphosa, who would be the next inhabitant of this grand home. And of course, that was against entirely the wishes of the man who hosted me there that evening, Jacob Zuma. And Ramaphosa would use those exact words, New Dawn, as a rallying counterpoint to the road to ruin charted by Zuma. Of course, it was precisely the hope of the New Dawn which helped power President Ramaphosa and his ANC to a fairly handsome, almost against the odds victory, although it lost some seats, but maintained its national and provincial power bases in the May 2019 elections here. But it is the dashed expectation of its achievement right now and looking into the future in the absence of any transcending agenda of reform by his government, which offers great peril to our country right now. But it is also paradoxically this dashed expectation which offers, I believe, huge opportunity to a political movement which can embrace and refresh a principled and pragmatic program to revive our economy and offer fresh hope to all its citizens. The name change from Libertas to New Dawn also proves how illusory labels are in politics. The name liberal means all kinds of things, and more of that in a moment. Most of them are entirely negative, as Jules perhaps suggested inferentially as introduction. The late Jeannie Kirkpatrick, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, once observed, "Political labeling is like parsley on a plate. It is decorative, but very seldom nourishing." Now, the second residence, which I visited far more recently, just over a month ago, is very far from here, just outside a beautiful town in Kent in England named Westerham. Chartwell was a country home occupied by Winston Churchill for over 40 years, from 1922 until his death in 1965. He left so many lessons of political leadership, innumerable mementos of which are scattered about the rather large and handsome rooms of his home. But just two of them are worth recalling for the purpose of tonight's topic. In his modestly comfortable Chartwell study, and I need to add this in, just inferentially or parenthetically, that those of you who've been there will know this, and those of you who haven't, I mentioned, and those of you who haven't read Richard Stein's book, or that probably means an audience about 3 tonight, so it comes to Revelation. But you look at the table, the study desk, it's scattered about with photographs of Churchill's children and wife, and there's only one person, not a family member, whose photograph's there, and that is Jan Smuts. But anyway, in that comfortable study, Churchill, of course, wrote the speeches, or dictated them, and the books, which helped save the world from fascist tyranny. His home served as the ground zero, as we would now say, when very much alone, he took on the might of the entire British establishment in the 1930s, even though, as the grandson of a duke, he was a charter member of it. In his wilderness years, without high office but with great influence, he warned of the menace of Hitler and prepared for the inevitable struggle against it. It is worth recalling, as his brilliant new biographer Andrew Roberts recounts in Churchill, Walking with Destiny, just what a contrarian and deeply unpopular position he held back then. Or perhaps a reminder of how the heresies of today can become the settled and received wisdom of the future. And of course, on a raft and range of issues, from Gallipoli to India to imperialism and many other miscues, he made some disastrous decisions. Perhaps that is inevitable for someone of his vigor and longevity and willed obstinacy. But as Roberts concludes his monumental work, the battles he won saved liberty. Churchill himself, who displayed such a copious combination of raw bravery in battle and in politics and sheer bloody-mindedness, never minded being alone, in the wrong company, or going against the grain of popular opinion. He offered a clarion call to politicians everywhere and in every epoch, which sadly finds only a very faint echo today, if it is heard at all. He said, "Courage is the first of all human qualities, because it is the quality that guarantees all the others. Courage to fight your corner, stick to your beliefs, is very hard, especially in South Africa, where, ironically, almost from the moment that full-blown democracy arrived here in 1994, a dominant hegemony often dictates the terms of the debate, limits the boundaries of the discourse, and heaps opprobrium on dissenters. Of course, the limits of dissent and disagreement here today are nowhere near as dire and dangerous as under the previous regime of racial nationalism, and free speech enjoys here, well, notionally at least, and notwithstanding the Human Rights Commission, full-blown constitutional protection. But in the furies of the moment, and charting a principled course for the future in our politics, any person or any party seeking to advance a creative and credible alternative needs as a minimum departure point a star, a fixed point to steer their course. Otherwise, to borrow a phrase, you'll be embarking on a journey without maps, and to modernize, without a GPS or the indispensable Waze app, which helps you get through Johannesburg's or Cape Town's even more horrific traffic, thank you to the DA, you will certainly lose your way or land up in a very bad place. Interestingly, during the helter-skelter constitutional negotiations of over 25 years ago, one person who navigated by a fixed and bright star was Nelson Mandela. I incidentally enjoyed the counsel and even the friendship of the great man, and managed to knock out a book about it called Opposite Mandela. As I used to say when Ben Trisk was selling them in exclusive books, every home should have one. But notwithstanding that, we had some pretty profound disagreements at times. And Mandela was certainly not, in the overall sense, a liberal, and his allegiance to the ANC was neither anything other than unconditional and absolute. But Mandela knew, like Churchill, exactly what he wanted. Those two great leaders were never dogmatic on tactics, but they were unyielding on their bottom lines. His close confidant, Mac Maharaj, who used to rush out of the negotiations chamber in Kempton Park and drive to Mandela's home in Houghton to brief him on proceedings, expressed this very cogently when he wrote, or was written in Anthony Sampson's biography of Mandela. Mandela's many zigzags were always leading to the same object. When I went to see him from the negotiating chamber, he would always ask, where does this take us towards majority rule? How long will it take? He was my compass throughout the talks. The Nats, or the National Party, had no compass. In the end, they were preoccupied only with their selfish interests. A colleague of mine from those times, indeed a colleague of Douglas's, was Dean Smuts. And Unshin, of course, who was a colleague of Dean Smuts. She very sadly, and many, I think, overlapped with Dean Smuts. So a few people who served with her here tonight. She very sadly and suddenly died in 2016. But her impeccable and adaptive liberalism was consequence of her approach to public life and how to navigate its often murky and treacherous waters. I had the opportunity, in her very live presence, to pay tribute to her consequential career when she left Parliament in 2014. What I said at her farewell function is, in my view, even more relevant to the political cause today, which she served with such distinction until fairly recently. Of the different types of politicians, I suggested, you can either be a weather vane or a signpost. If you are the former, you will twist in the wind, depend for your advice on the last person you spoke to or the last opinion poll you consulted. You will suck up to those in power and trim your sails to the prevailing winds of political correctness. That is the easy path of least resistance, and it usually leads downhill. Or you can be that rarer bird in the political aviary, a signpost which does not bend to the vagaries of the moment, someone who stands for a cause greater than personal advancement and temporary vote winning, but for an enduring set of principles and of beliefs. Now that the Democratic Alliance contemplates its future challenges after its first electoral setback since 1994, it might have some regard for that taxonomy. Martin Wolf, in a recent essay in the Financial Times, suggested that liberalism is not a precise philosophy, it is an attribute. But quite whether or not its meaning is precise and its formulas fixed, it certainly needs to be advanced with courage, self-confidence, and conviction to rework the Churchill formula. And as Martin Wolf, Thomas Nagel, and John Rawls, and many other liberal philosophers attest, it does in fact have several key fixed points by which it is guided. The individual, as the touchstone of value in any society, is the essential here. As Wolf wrote recently, all liberals share this in common: a belief in human agency. They trust in the capacity of humans to decide things for themselves. This belief has radical implications. It implies the right to make their own plans, to express their own opinions, to participate in public life. These attributes were realized in a system called liberal democracy. And it was interesting that Wolf's essay was written in response to the unbridled attack on liberalism in June by the illiberal elected autocrat of Russia, President Vladimir Putin, who declared that, and I quote, "The liberal idea has become obsolete. It has come into conflict with the interests of the overwhelming majority of the population." Putin is the latest member of a not overly distinguished lineup to announce liberalism's death rights. In defense of liberalism today, its advocates noted that 2 centuries of human progress, intellectually, politically, and materially, have been underpinned by liberalism, which has brought unparalleled benefits to mankind. In contrast, the kleptocracy over which Putin presides, coupled with generous doses of local repression and international aggression, the Times of London, for example, suggested societies based on the principles that Mr. Putin rejected have been unarguably more successful and vibrant than their authoritarian alternatives. Citizens of liberal democracies enjoy freedoms and rights embedded in legally enforceable rules that promote social harmony, preserve justice, and limit the powers of the state. But there certainly is no doubt that the brand and basis of liberalism is under threat and under question. Not because its underpinnings are wrong, as in fact no comparative system has ever been found to preserve for the world an international order of the likes of the liberal international order. But it's under question and perhaps threat because of several reasons. One, it was prematurely triumphant, as in the 1989 end of history thesis of Francis Fukuyama, or because it did not popularize itself in the face of its association with elite insiders and economic unfairness, or its unwillingness to address the real concerns of democratic voters everywhere, whether from the destructive power of underregulated banks to the fear of automation, the overreach of big data, dislike for unanswerable bureaucracies, the contempt that many hold for elites, to alarm over uncontrolled borders. Each of these actually, if you drill down in it, if liberals could be bothered, has a liberal answer. But before it can be given, the questions actually need to be acknowledged, and the concerns and the citizens who raise them actually need to be respected. 2 recent democratic answers to this, take back control, which won the argument for Brexit, and drain the swamp, which did the trick for Donald Trump, are in fact real and relevant concerns and fears, even if the answers and the messengers chosen for their achievement are deeply flawed. Now, at this point, if you're still awake, you might ask, what on earth has this got to do with South Africa and the need for a liberal party? Having set the question, let me now briefly attempt to answer it. Let me, though, add this. Unique as we often see ourselves, or parochial as we very often are in dealing with our challenges, I want to set out why the international and historical trends and the core political convictions which are needed and the courage to advance them stems from a very long and an almost unbroken tradition. So together with my brother Peter, who I'm pleased has managed to join us tonight, I was born into a liberal family in Durban over 62 years ago, several years after him. 18 months, he'll tell you, anyway. Now, Douglas, about to withdraw all the compliments, yes, that I made about you earlier. So our family was very secular in our views and our way of life, although one of the tribes we belonged to was Jewish. I suppose if I'd thought about it back then, which I certainly didn't do at the time, there is a direct link between liberalism and the Judeo-Christian tradition, or, if you like, between political ideology and ethical values. Judaism, for example, has always valued the individual. Old Testament thinkers regarded each person as precious because he or she was created in God's image. That was a time when other people had barely begun to think of individuals except as members of a tribe or a group or a race. Thus, humans have intellect, capability, they have pride and ambition. They are capable of great achievement and great evil, or great disaster and great good. So even while growing up under the dark shadow of apartheid, my liberal education and inclination was really a matter of birth and of listening to conversations from my parents at home. So I never really developed an early philosophy other than a detestation of the prevailing racial order. But when I went to Wits University, just across the road from here, and was embroiled in all manner of political antagonism, including with David Ferreira, who I'm glad to see us here tonight, with the political left and right of those times, I read one book, Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, which fused the liberal idea with its more ancient heritage. And I realized on reading that book that this offered a way out of the racial nationalist trap in which South Africa was then, perhaps is now, ensnared. Arthur Koestler, of course, was an intellectual apostate. He converted from staunch support for Soviet communism until he resigned from the Communist Party of Germany in 1938, a seminal year for that country and for the world. In 1940, he published his famous novel, Darkness at Noon, as testament to what he now embraced and to what he had so recently rejected. Many decades later, when I first read it, an essential passage of it to me struck me as the ideological dividing line between liberalism and collectivism, or the individual versus the group. He wrote, "I don't approve of mixing ideologies. There are only two conceptions of human ethics, and they are at opposite poles. One of them, Christian and humane, declares the individual to be sacrosanct and asserts that the rules of arithmetic are not to be applied to human units. The other starts from the basic principle that a collective aim justifies all means, and not only allows but demands that the individual should in every way be subordinated and sacrificed to the community." If liberals in South Africa and in the world recognize which side of this divide they stand on, then at least they have a compass to find their true north and chart their responses and reactions to a swirl of events and challenges. It is likely to be far more reliable and enduring than an opinion poll, Twitter and its outrages, wokeness, and the fetid stew of identitarian politics and its adherents. On the fallacy of the so-called identity politics practiced by very illiberal people and its rather spurious intellectual foundations, a very striking critique was provided recently by Professor Stephen Holmes of New York University in his review of a new work by Kwame Anthony Appiah, The Lies That Bind. Just read you one paragraph from that. All classifications such as race, religion, culture, and social status or class are false in some important sense and distort the way we see ourselves and treat each other. The fault of essentialism about identities, as Appiah terms it, is to assume that there is an inner something common to all members of an identity group. In general, there isn't some inner essence that explains why people of a certain social group are the way that they are. The facile assumption that similarity or sameness can create group cohesion or explain why groups hold together is absurd on its face. Since similarity and sameness are not social relations at all, but simply comparisons that imply nothing about cooperative relations or emotional identifications. This allows us to simplify a complex reality by attributing a spurious homogeneity and unchanging nature to heterogeneous and constantly shape-shifting swathes of the human population. Now, in the same manner, local commentator and former editor of Business Day, Songezo Zibi, identified the dangers here of race holding and its deleterious consequences. In an article entitled "Recover Blackness Butchered During the Zuma Years," he writes, and I quote, "When did we as black people lose the ability to identify clear principles and stand by them, especially when our own violate those principles? Is it the collective trauma of white racism that drives us to a mentality where an irrational closing of ranks is a natural instinct, even though we end up protecting and helping those who seek to destroy?" Now, not everyone in our country, or even the liberal camp here, enjoys the moral courage and intellectual clarity of Songezo Zibi. And others who advance the principle first and anticipate the consequences for its advancement afterwards, which is actually what you should do rather than the other way around. And then there are those who simply concern themselves with the reaction of the normal suspects and abandon the principle entirely or never bother to advance it in the first place. It was Helen Ziller, who I see has commendably joined the ranks of the Institute of Race Relations this week, who in April 2018 drew my attention to that danger. In South Africa today, there is often a very deep fear, for some of the reasons I described above, and for another that I'll address shortly, for falling on the wrong side. Not so much of ideology, but of political fashion, or of daring to venture outside the strict limits demarcated for debate by the new thought police. These folk, who would never dream of voting or supporting the Democratic Alliance, for example, but who are on command of various what is called digital guillotines, never resist calling out the party for its infractions of the ideological hegemon. Often, instead of fighting its corner or pushing back, the official opposition tries, in the late former opposition leader Van Zyl Slabbert's phrase, to out-Mau Mau the Mau Mau. There are many examples of this tendency. I'll not elaborate on them, save to provide two examples of an often general trend. Eskom is the failing state-owned enterprise. I hardly need to remind you, thank heavens the lights are still on, and I know millions of your taxpayers' rands is pumping diesel through them as we speak now. And not surprisingly, it has accumulated a debt of 450 billion rand. And that danger could topple over our entire economy, if not our country. Eskom is a poster boy, writ large, for every failure, every single failure, embedded in the state-centric transformational project of this government. Beyond the well-chronicled corruption, board mismanagement, abuse of its monopoly status, overstaffing, all of which are anathema to both liberal economics and sound practice, there is the issue of employment equity. Not the desire, which was entirely commendable and correct, to open the doors of Eskom to new entrants, but the application in utter rigidity against all logic of racial quotas, which meant removing qualified engineers because of their race and not because of their competence and their commitment. We recently had evidence published in April this year that thousands of qualified electrical engineers were removed in this cavalier, self-harming manner. According to one report, and I quote from it, in March 2015, Eskom shared its plans to decrease the number of skilled white employees by 3,389 to meet its affirmative action targets. If this was entirely and depressingly predictable, and the concern and the outrage which followed equally so, less obvious was the response to the stratagem by a senior Democratic Alliance MP who messaged on Twitter, and I quote, "To say that affirmative action appointments are to blame for the crisis at Eskom is racist. It is based on the belief that blacks are inferior and cannot be properly qualified and capable," unquote. Now, I have no idea, and certainly no search that I've done in my rather limited Google-esque way has proven it, that anyone actually made the suggestion or had the motive imputed to them by this MP. But to suggest that calling out a demonstrably economically ruinous and illiberal policy, which would cause our great late friend Otto Graf Lambsdorff to spin in his grave, to suggest that this illiberal policy and calling it out makes the caller racist or implies malign, hidden and immoral stereotyping simply repeats the moral ammunition which the ANC rains down on its enemies and those who demand as a minimum in this country good governance and the application of sound policy. Mischaracterizations, you see, lead to many, many mistakes. And in the same news cycle, extraordinary, it happened within 24 hours, another DA figure, its youth leader, offered a profoundly illiberal perspective on who should actually participate in our recent election. He commenced a lobby and a petition to call for the exclusion from the poll of a racist fringe group, Black Land First, because in his view, the BLF has shown itself to be a cabal of unrepentant racists whose mission is to divide South Africans along racial lines and to undermine the constitutional values. I need to add parenthetically that actually the voters of South Africa have remarkably good common sense. They awarded this lunatic fringe party all of about 8,000 votes or something, 0.001% or some ridiculously low number. But I was more interested in the remark of the youth leader of the party that I led for 13 years. Because taken to its logical conclusion, quite a number of parties larger than the BLF, including one of whom keeps our party in power in Pretoria and Johannesburg, well, I did until 5 o'clock tonight, but maybe that's changed, would also have excluded, it would have merited exclusion on this test. But the test that he set, however electorally pleasing, does considerable violence to the free market of ideas, which should be the core view of liberal and democratic discourses anywhere in the world. It is also worth recalling that in 1970, on the eve of the South African, then white general election, Helen Suzman, at a public meeting in the Weizmann Hall in support of Colin Eglin, called for the South African Communist Party to be unbanned, even though on any poll, we didn't have Twitter in those days, the greatest single threat as perceived by white South Africans was the Communist Party. Colin Eglin went on to lose the election by 234 votes the following week, and we used to have a lot of discussions whether that particular remark of Helen's caused the loss, but she said That is an completely immovable principle. Recently, I have to add, the BLF was in fact deregistered as a political party by the IEC, and I have to say it was an application of the Freedom Front Plus, so never as too strange a world in South Africa, and was excluded because of its racially exclusive constitution. But to me, the salient issue here, which goes way beyond this lunatic fringe party, is the issue which has so polluted and confined our public discourse, that we cannot, we should not, we never should ban or limit offensive speech, because that's what free speech is all about. And you know, the liberal approach to me was summed up in the title of a book by the late Anthony Lewis, who did what he called a biography of the First Amendment in the US, and he said, he called it freedom for the thought that we hate. Because that, frankly, makes, in Nietzsche's words, life worth living. Because otherwise you're going to live in a narrow-minded, cut-off, completely confined society, unopen to new ideas. Now, perhaps the adherents of those who would cut off the debate or mischaracterize people who have an unpopular opinion genuinely believe that contrary views and voices which do not fit the dominant narrative and stand outside the intellectual hegemon constructed like an iron wall around the policy choices for South Africans need, in fact, to be excluded from the debate entirely. Or that those who go against the grains of these times, or the grain of our times, should be labeled as moral criminals, to borrow the phrase of my late friend, Professor Etienne Moreinik. He, incidentally, Etienne Moreinik, from an intellectually brave and very rigorous position, was among the very first, at the dawn of our democracy, to call the stigma labeling for what it is. In 1995, at the height of the so-called Makgoba affair, in which he was embroiled at Wits University, he wrote prophetically that liberals especially would again become stigmatized with renewed ferocity in the new South Africa, just as they had been in the old. He wrote, "Liberal has again become the stigma label. Under Verwoerd and Forster, liberal was the stigma label of choice. It meant so far left as to be almost communist. But now, in the new South Africa, it means so far right as to be almost racist. It is a new psycho trick, calculated to taint the Democrats on one's right with the authoritarianism of those much further to the right." There is, in my view, another explanation for how the dominant discourse, often its policies, its illiberalism, has swept beyond the walls of the ANC fortress and its foot soldiers, and now manifests itself everywhere, from business to civil society, and sometimes even into the ranks of the official opposition of South Africa. Once again, it was Arthur Koestler who gave voice to this tendency when he made a very influential speech at the Carnegie Hall in New York in 1948. He said, "You can't help people being right for the wrong reasons. The fear of finding oneself in bad company is not an expression of political purity, it is an expression of lack of self-confidence." Koestler was referring to the liberal critics of communism, who often feared to give voice at that time to their opinions in public for fear of being labeled with the brush of reaction, as the late great historian Tony Judt elaborates in his History of Europe since 1945, post-war. Thus it was, at the same time as the first major show trials in Eastern Europe, and as Stalin's murderous fist expanded beyond the Soviet Union, that the world witnessed, for the main, the mute silence of most European and often American intellectuals against its excesses. Judt provides a compelling explanation for the lack of backbone. He said, or wrote, "The left had the wind in its sails and history on its side. At the core of the anti-fascist rhetoric of the official left was a simple binary view of history. They, the fascists, the Nazis, the Francoists, the nationalists are right, we are left. They are reactionary, we are progressive. They stand for war, we stand for peace. They are the forces of evil, we are on the side of good." You can make the necessary substitutions in South Africa today. The fear of being tarred with a brush of racism, or the label anti-transformation, the need for affirmation by those on the so-called right side of history, the muting of the voices of dissenters outside the dominant discourse. But to allow this to become the lodestar of the opposition or of civil society or even of business seems to me a very poor reading of history and even worse, politics. Perhaps this might explain the following paragraph, which appeared in the 2019 election manifesto of the Democratic Alliance. Under the headline of a new plan to realize economic justice for all South Africans, the text reads, and I quote, "The reason that the DA supports a program of race-based redress is simply put because it is an important part of our country's reconciliation project and vital for justice. This means that a program of redress does need a sunset clause. As a party that believes in liberal values and principles, we would seek to ensure that we move to a non-racial position as soon as a successful redress program has been implemented," unquote. Nothing convinces, as the saying goes, so much as conviction. But the have cake, will eat it formula baked into that particular prescription, which actually offers race-based redress now, coupled with the promise of non-racial liberalism at some indeterminate point in the future, seems to me a spectacular example of doublethink, equivocation, and appealing to everyone and pleasing no one. Incidentally, precisely that criticism was made of the British Labour Party after its recent electoral implosion in the elections to the European Parliament. On the burning issue of Brexit, which saw a new party enjoying that name surge into first place in the British poll, even though it had been established entirely 6 weeks before the election, and the official opposition Labour limped to third place with just 13.7% support, Labour attempted to fudge and equivocate on the issue. It tried to face two ways at once, offering something to everyone and convincing no one, as one analyst noted. Van Zyl-Slabbert, another predecessor leader of party, provided an early warning in June 2006 when he delivered a speech at a conference held on the revival of race classification in post-apartheid South Africa. He offered both a warning and a prescription. He called for South Africa to move away from its stubborn obsession with race. And he predicted, if you make yourself hostage to a racist past, you can bank generously on a racist future. 13 years on, Slabbert's prophecy has been realized, even perhaps sometimes in the party he once led. If liberalism is about the individual as a touchstone of value in society, it always is going to have a hard swim in the mephitic and murky waters of our politics. Hence the need for the long obedience and the politics of the long haul, to quote another well-known liberal leader of our times, or past times, Colin Eglin. But the liberal ideal and the policies which flow from it does provide a rallying point and fixed star to guide and navigate with. It is, in marketing terms, a very useful product differentiator. Or, as Professor Herman Guillemets advised the DA Parliamentary Caucus some years ago, you should not bat on your opponent's pitch. The United States Chief Justice, John Roberts, gave a pithy riposte to the urge to use race as a proxy for disadvantage, a burning issue which tends to immolate anyone who suggests otherwise. He suggested, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. But according to the formula offered by my party, cited above, race-based redress is vital for justice. This in turn is reference to an undeniable and hugely relevant fact of South African life, also cited quite correctly and commendably by the DA in the same manifesto, from which I quote. Millions of people, still trapped by our legacy of racial exclusionary policies, live in grinding poverty with no real chance of escape or of a better life. So if liberalism is about the rights and ambitions and affirmation of the individual citizen, then self-evidently it cannot be indifferent to poverty and inequality. These blight any possibility that the individual, whoever he or she is, and whatever condition they find themselves, particularly at the lower end of the rung, whatever race, can ever reach their destiny and improve their life chances. And that is why policies to boost economic growth are a cause not for the rich and the comfortable, but for everyone, especially the most disadvantaged. Over 20 years ago, Ken Andrew MP spelt this out with crystalline clarity when he said, if poverty is to be alleviated, there is no substitute for economic growth. Anyone who really cares about the poor must be passionate about economic growth. For example, let's bring this up to date, if South Africa were to achieve annual GDP growth of 5.3% as promised but never cited in our National Development Plan, we would double national income per capita in just 14 years. But if we continue our present bumping along on the bottom end of between 0 and 1% GDP growth, it'll take around 70 years to achieve the same outcome. So is the only solution now to apply more race-based policies to offset the legacy of previous race-based policies in order for people to climb the ladder out of poverty? Professor Charles Simpkins, head of research at the Helen Suzman Foundation, thinks it isn't. He offered a recent, realistic, and in my view, compelling answer. Lowering the salience of race will be very slow at best. But this does not imply a lack of attention to issues of poverty and social inclusion. But it does imply using criteria other than race as a basis for entitlement and obligation. He then cites the fact that social grants use non-racial categories, age, health status, income, etc., as the basis for allocation, and then notes, grants, social grants, are disproportionately allocated to black people, but blackness is not the criterion for the assistance. Precisely the same, some of you in this room might be vaguely aware of, for the funding of the grants, the taxpayer. Taxation is based on income, consumption, and profit. The incidence of taxation falls disproportionately on white people, but whiteness is not the criterion for the obligation. And Simpkins asks a question essential for any liberal party. Indeed, one of the self-proclaimed aims of the DA, for example, in its recent manifesto. He asked, how do you stop the mobilization of voters on racial lines if you use race as a category for your own policy of redress? Now, more recently, on the 17th of July 2019 in Parliament, the current leader of the Democratic Alliance, Mmusi Maimane MP, called for the scrapping of the broad-based black economic empowerment model on the grounds of its ineffectiveness and exclusions. He said, it does nothing for 99% of South Africa's excluded citizens. Maimane has not yet indicated whether he will take the same opposition scalpel to the paraphernalia of race-based post-apartheid legislation and regulations, a cornerstone of which is the Employment Equity Act 55 of 1998. So, let me conclude with a story from my time when the Liberal opposition here, in case you think it's pretty dire now, was in far worse condition than it is today in South Africa. And just let me signpost some of the array of challenges we faced back then. When I became party leader in 1994, my campaign to become party leader was run by Douglas Gibson over the telephone. It didn't cost 400 million rand. It cost about, I don't know, whatever the Gibson Parktown North phone bill was. That was how I got elected. But I was standing against Ken Andrew, not in Nkosazana at Lamini Zuma. So it was a slightly gentler contest. When I became the party leader in 1994, we had none of the advantages which the DA has today. A big and diverse party, multiple caucuses, governance of a province, and a professional political machine, and a large funding base. Oh, and we also had the singular disadvantage of leading the opposition to one of the most universally admired and celebrated icons of the age, Nelson Mandela. But one of the many disadvantages which we faced back then was that the small Democratic Party, aside from its obvious negatives, had a further and less obvious disadvantage. It was an ideological fruit salad, with bits and pieces in its internal DNA, from hardcore liberals to anti-apartheid end conscription activists to refugees from other political movements. And what had sustained and held the party together when apartheid was the dominant issue and the fight against apartheid was the glue which unified the organization, would clearly not sustain the party now that apartheid had formally at least ended by its own hand in 1994 and we entered the brave new world of democracy. So the party required far more clarity, and it needed a much sharper focus if it was to be seen and heard amidst the competing din of the new politics. So we set about, among a myriad of other tasks, of trying to distill the essence of our offer in the here and now and into the future South Africa. In this task, which took many forms, policies, congresses, and was more often than not railroaded by many diversions, which we never anticipated but always had to deal with, we settled on a phrase and unpacked a set of policies which we framed around our offer of an open and opportunity society. In fact, the author of that document, Ryan Coetzee, is somewhere in the audience here tonight. But the open half of our prospectus was clear enough, both then and now. Defend the Constitution, promote the rule of law, advance the rights of individual citizens against those who would encroach their liberties, cultural, personal, linguistic, and economic. Advancing and achieving and preserving these so-called negative liberties had been the core business of the party and its predecessors since 1959, and we knew how to do it. But on the opportunity part of the agenda, it was not always clear that the liberal agenda could compete in the new political marketplace and break through the sound barrier to any effect. Despite the risk of being called various uncomplimentary names, or worse, as we duly were, and all the dangers associated with breaking the politically comfortable but economically stultifying and job-destroying consensus which then existed between the government and big business and labor union groupings in South Africa, we moved on. So aside from giving the party some clear blue water between itself and its opponents, it also helped to provide a cohering vision or glue for party members and supporters. I would reckon to say that most DP and later on DA members knew where they stood and what they stood for. The party grew rapidly and attracted people who never in a month of Sundays or years of Sundays would have described themselves as liberal. But we had a set of values, principles, and policies which could be broadly stamped as liberal Democrat, which helped glue our parts together. It held us together, and our principles were put into practice. And so, starting from our principles, not from some perception of how some adherents in the darker era of darker parts of the web might receive them, we opposed a raft of positively labeled legislation, such as the Employment Equity Bill and the Labor Relations Bill, which had, as we predicted they would have, hugely negative consequences. And incidentally, if you want to see how negative they are, just go and look at the record unemployment figures revealed yesterday in South Africa. We were called names and we moved on. And yet we kept winning more votes. Some said we had painted ourselves into a corner, but the funny thing was the corner kept getting bigger. We proposed our own policies, from the social markets economy document to the agenda for a better country. We advanced our principles and anticipated the reaction to their advancement and not the other way around. Our principles and policies determined where we were positioned in the political spectrum and not the reverse. And just to prove, in the words of King Solomon, that there is nothing new under the sun, we had no shortage of problems back then in the mid-1990s, with people demanding entitlement and promotion in the party on the basis of liberal categories such as race and language. At a party congress way back in 1997, I cautioned, we need to be certain when we talk of merit, not colour, and excellence with equity, and when we attack unprincipled affirmative action which favours the liberation aristocracy of the new elite, that we don't in our own party move towards any entitlement based on group membership. The message we apply to government needs application here and now in our own party. Of course, not everyone agreed, and we had a lot of setbacks and disappointments on the route we chose, and we sometimes failed to hit the targets that we set for ourselves. But we understood the need to keep going and the politics of the long haul. In April 2005, appropriate lecture in honour of Helen Suzman, I tried to crystallize the aspects of the liberal state at work in the most positive terms. Liberal policies can help the poor. A flexible labour market creates more jobs. School vouchers can improve opportunities for education. Successful private hospitals create better health care for all. The illiberal state removes barriers to market entry that stifle individual opportunity and enterprise. And then quoting John Cain Berman, the liberal state is frugal with taxes, recognizing that they are the fruits of human labor, not the property of the state. Where it collects taxes to redistribute, it does so in a way to help the poor start climbing the ladder of self-reliance and success. It avoids doing things that profit-driven entrepreneurs could do more effectively. Where it has to make trade-offs, it favors liberty above restriction, the poor above the rich, and consumers above producers. The further advantage of a liberal state as a precursor of widening freedom and expanding choices for all its people would be to create a nation of empowered citizens rather than a subset of victims of past and present circumstances. Then more people than ever will live the truth of the Russian-born poet and Nobel laureate Joseph Brodsky, who wrote, "A free man when he fails blames nobody." Does this prescription fit the DA offer of an open opportunity society today? Perhaps it does, perhaps it's been refashioned, or parts have been discarded. But this, or some similar formula, in my view, provided the party at its most difficult and challenging times with a clear roadmap and a store of values to measure government activity and to promote its own agenda. It also ensured, despite name-calling and race-holding, which so poisons the political discourse, that the party had a distinctive vision to call its own, to fire up its supporters, and to confront its many opponents. Now, of course, 14 years after I made those remarks, South Africa is still facing the same problems, only more of them in much less benign local and international economic circumstances than it did back then. And there are many other items from that same broad menu: liberty, choice, competition, opportunity, and equality, which are even more relevant today and on which far more research and real-time application exists in the world than they did when I offered that prescription back then. So I think the need for a liberal party, armed with courage, clarity, self-confidence, vision, and purpose, is needed now, at this time of demoralization and peril in our country, more than ever. Renewal, though, is needed. It always has been for the long political journey. And part of that renewal is not to simply hold up a mirror to the government and point out the many things that so many of us know that it has got wrong. It is even more vital, now that the election dust is settled, for the opposition to hold up a mirror to its own soul, process in which commendably the DA is currently involved. The Chinese strategist Sun Tzu offered, well, we actually don't know if he offered it because no one has ever wrote these things, but it's rather a commendable aphorism for these times. He offered an ancient aphorism, no less compelling in these times of bewildering uncertainty and complexity in the battle for ideas to move our country forward. If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself, but not your enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. Thank you.
Tony will now be taking some questions. Thank you, Tony. Please do raise your hand. Please briefly state who you are and try to keep your questions very short and sharp and to the point.
Unlike the speech, short and sharp, yes.
Is the future of liberalism in South Africa, in your view, secure in the hands of the DA? Or has the time come for a new party with ideological honesty and integrity when it comes to liberal values? Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew, and you, of course, also come from a distinguished political family. Look, I'm not attached to labels of parties. I was more or less born in the Progressive Party, or we were, and then became the PRP, PFP, DP, and it changed and evolved and grew. So the DA has no exclusive rights to be the custodian of any one set of values, and there might be others. But let me say this, and since I spent most of my adult life building the DA up with some very significant assistance from the people mentioned and unmentioned in this room, that I wouldn't throw away a party which has got 20% of the votes in South Africa, and who knows what will happen to the ANC, which might at some future point disintegrate, that controls one of the 9 provinces and governs it quite well, and which significant parts of which are liberal democratic in the DA. Now, I quite, as I do, I call the DA out when I think that it's made some infractions. But I remain DA, and I remain of the hope that the DA will get its mojo back, intellectually, ideologically, and electorally as well. I think that's perfectly possible. And I hope it happens, because, I would not throw away the DA simply on the grounds of, ideological or political purity. Because I think we saw in the election, there were parties that were far more ideologically coherent than the DA, both to its left and its right, that did extremely badly in the election. And, a political party, if it's going to mean anything and make a difference, I quote Dean Smuts, most wonderful and really very difficult colleague. Ryan will tell you, you'd give Dean Smuts a statement and say, I'm not going to issue this. Rubbish. Perhaps a few more people in the DA should have that view, might have better statements, but anyway. Or Douglas used to have to deal with, Douglas is an ultimate diplomat, very good at dealing with very clever, not always easy colleagues. But Dean said, and it's in the front piece of a very excellent book, Parasites or Patriots or Parasites. She said, you can either make a noise or make a difference. And, making a noise is very important, and I was accused of, doing that. But when you have political power, even in a small sense, as municipal, provincial, and hopefully one day nationally, you can really make a profound difference. And sometimes you can influence the difference by being ahead of the curve, not just, surfing behind it, as we sometimes do. So I'm giving you quite a long answer, but Andrew, I do not believe, and I'm not saying this because I've got any skin in the game, I do not think the DA is beyond redemption. I do not think it's suddenly fallen into the clutches of an illiberal cabal, but I think it needs, as I said in my remarks tonight, to repurpose itself. That's what I think, and I hope it will do so.
I'll tell both of them. Tony, it's so good to hear you again. 40 years ago, you and I were in student politics together.
Good heavens, yes, that's right.
You were the vice president at Wits and I was at Natal Varsity. And as you spoke today, I thought you convinced me then that you were just far more adept at the political sphere than I would ever be. So I went into a much easier job of becoming a social worker. And it's in that context that the question I want to ask you. I spent most of yesterday morning in the home of Mavuso Msimang, who has become a close friend and somebody who I think very much epitomizes the signpost rather than the wind vane within the ANC context. And I wasn't there to talk to him about his membership of the ANC per se, but just the question of where are we going? And would he not leave the ANC and give up on the ANC as his daughter has done, Sazonke and others, writing them off? And he said he would if there was a party that could actually carry with him the sense of the deep values and concerns that he embodies as somebody who is very much a Mandela-like character in my experience. So my question really is the notion of a Liberal Party being formed? Because if it is, from my work as a social worker in the Eastern Cape, fighting Australian mining companies, Chinese investment companies, who are wanting to basically take us back to the dreadful days of apartheid, where traditional leaders are co-opted, are part and parcel of a systematic land grab type process, that's where I would hope a Liberal Party would incubate its ideas. And I don't want to be critical because I live in Joburg too, rather than in the country clubs of Johannesburg, because that is where I see the future of our country needing. I was interviewing Mavuso for a YouTube video which will be up shortly, and I'm not trying to sort of punt it, but it helps us to try and really grapple with some really deep issues that are far more fundamental than who holds power in Parliament.
No, I think that's a very good point. Good to see you again. Look, I mean, there are many fora. One of the criticisms of the DA, because I'm assisting a little exercise the party's going through at the moment, was that they had these showbiz rallies during the election. But I promise you, they weren't in the country club of Johannesburg. They were in Orlando. Douglas, where were they? Dobsonville Stadium. All over the place. So, the DA in the last election got 500,000 black African votes. Not nearly as many as they hoped for, but it's 500,000 black South Africans who voted for it, more than had voted for it 5 years before, and certainly more than voted for it when I was in charge. I hope that's a correlation, not a causation, incidentally, but I don't know. And, they've got to do a number of things. But really, without misunderstanding your question, but to make the point, you've got to have a compass, because otherwise all's lost. And, interesting enough, I was looking at some evidence, and you certainly should use polls, not to determine your stand on issue, but, find other useful facts. That there are apparently 20% or so of South Africans who happen to be black, who would very happily consider, not a label, but a party or a movement, which has nothing to do with racial preferencing. So there is a universe of future voters out there who I think are available. Now, look, I mean, all of us have associations, and we come with baggage and heritage. And people are very critical, well, it's the white party or whatever. But it happens that, 46% of the current electorate of the DA is white. And in turn, 75% of whites vote for the Democratic Alliance. So it's not just a base, but sort of constituency that needs to be served along with any others. And any organization, if you read R.W. Johnson's recent book, Fighting for the Dream, which tries to create a large multiracial organization in South Africa, has set itself a hell of a task. He suggests the only enduringly successful multiracial organization in South Africa are the churches, particularly the Anglican and the Catholic churches. And he then says the reason they have sustained themselves, been multiracial and significant, is because they have a creedal disposition, obviously. You know, you're a Catholic, you have to have core beliefs, or shouldn't be a Catholic, and they have external authority, either Rome or Canterbury. And I think it's very true. But that's why you need, after an election, to spend quite a lot of time getting your creed fit for purpose. I'm keeping everyone from your bar. Listen, the only reason people came tonight was to enjoy your drinks and snacks, and I'm keeping them from them.
Thank you. Thanks, Ronnie. It's an honour to ask this question. I fully agree with the idea of implementing policies that encourage economic growth, where the market takes precedence. Unfortunately, in my experience as a small business person who was participating during the year where we experienced 6% economic growth, which was the highest economic growth that South Africa's experienced since the 1960s. Unfortunately, I did not see the trickle effect in action.
Yeah.
And I believe SS skilled labour, and I want to put emphasis on skilled, because there are people in factories that have got a lot of experience, they've been in for many years, that know their job, they know what they're doing. But unfortunately, they are still vulnerable to being taken advantage of by virtue of the high unemployment rate. And they're often threatened with being replaced. And this is my own experience in the company that I was working for, by being replaced by the long queue of people looking for a job. So unfortunately, they are willing to accept very low wages to produce products that make exceptional profits for the owners of the company. So how do we as a liberal group compel the captains, and I say captains in inverted commas, because they are more captains by virtue of just being there at the right time, as opposed to really offering profound new ways of doing business. How do you compel the captains of industry to consider their staff as opposed to their own pockets and luxuries that they are so willing to buy?
Well, look, I mean, to answer the question, it's a very long, it's not a subject for tonight because it requires serious examination. Just make 3 points very, very quickly. As Bill Clinton once said, you can't just double down on trickle down. So economic growth in and of itself is not a silver bullet, but is the absolute minimum precondition to everything else. So is a tax base, incidentally, so we can bewail evil capitalists and rich folk. But, the more of them leave the country, and you saw accompanying our shocking unemployment figures, is once again, yet again, the SA Revenue Service has reported, I think also yesterday, on a pretty bleak day, that there's a very significant undercollection by SA Revenue in the current tax year. So the projections of Treasury to fund all these other massive social and redistribution programs are not going to be met, which increases the borrowing, which pushes our debt into, almost debt-trap territory, and so on and so forth. So I absolutely agree that you've got to have a couple of arrows in your quiver. But the biggest and most important one is to get the growth rate up. And then you can have a conversation about a lot of other things, although, we should be creating a nation we have to encourage those entrepreneurs. We have to encourage those factory owners. Or we've got to say that the government has conspicuously failed to do for the last 25 years. And that is to do two things. You can have a high wage economy, and you can have a restrictive labour practice, which we certainly have. provided, and you can have more growth and more employment, provided you have world-class infrastructure and you have high skills. So what we have done is to pretty much decimate our infrastructure and to dumb down our skills by providing the worst education in the world, practically. Well, I think actually. You go to the Gaza Strip, you get a better maths and science education in South Africa. So you've got a choice. So the problem with our government and their policy choice, they don't say, well, you know, we've got to make a choice. They'll say we'll have it all, and then you land up with very little.
My name is Mark Oppenheimer of the Johannesburg Bar. Tony, you
touched on a number of very important topics. I think looking at the dangers of ignoring non-racialism in South Africa is one of the most important issues in the country. But to my mind, the issue that really could tank South Africa's future is this change to our constitution. For the first time ever, there is a move to remove a right from the Bill of Rights, namely to allow for expropriation without compensation. What steps ought to be taken, given how far down the road we are in this process, where we endanger not only the property of white commercial farmers, but really the property of all South Africans, which could lead to a lack of investment, a destabilization of the economy, and the kind of future that has been already seen by our neighbor Zimbabwe and what is happening in Venezuela.
Yeah, I think Advocate Oppenheimer make a very important point. I think it was the Indian Supreme Court said in 1970, when you take away an essential pillar of your constitution, one pillar, the whole constitutional edifice crumbles, or worse, that effect. And I, absolutely, listen, we were in the room, Douglas and I and a few others, when that Section 25 was hammered out. And it, was very hard fought. And it itself is a compromise, which does offer some protection, but it really is a protection against arbitrary seizure. It certainly allows expropriation after due process. So that's what you have. Now you can take two views. If you're a pragmatist, you can take a robust view and say, well, what will finally come out of it will be an amendment which will really not change the fundamental principle embodied in Section 25, which really is, as you know, is a shopping list of various options from good to bad to indifferent already there. Or you can say, the view, well, once you've actually started tinkering with that clause, the whole thing is up for grabs. So, that's why I have been, poor man's Churchill, I can write and speak, but I have, from a position of no power, as he was, but a very poor man's Churchill. But, that's why whatever I've had chance to see, to write, speak, and engage on it, I've been very opposed to the amendment of any sort. But in the world of pragmatism rather than principle, maybe they will concoct some amendment which actually doesn't really change the status quo very much. But I think you've always got to have regard for the fact when you start on that process, it becomes a slippery slope. Yeah, Jill, the famous liberal. Sorry, I'm not the question master. Maybe Jill. Oh, sorry. And then you must close the slate and open the bar, which is the central reason most people go.
My name is Gwen Ngwenya. I suppose the question I'd like to ask you is with regards to holding the line, but I'd like to preface that briefly by saying that I think it's much harder to uproot illiberal values and ideas once they have taken root than to try and prevent them from finding fertile soil in a political party in the first place. I mean, illustrative of that is that I think today you'll hardly find any white South African, or it will be difficult to do so, who will admit to having voted for the National Party. And I have absolutely no doubt that as much as I personally struggled to get the DA to abandon race-based policy, that in a few years' time you'll find almost no DA public representative who will admit to having supported race-based policy within the party. So, and I think, as I say, that is because uprooting liberal values or ideas, or any idea for that matter, probably requires a lot more confrontation and conflict than most people are prepared for. So that being the case, I'd like to ask you about how to, in fact, then hold the line and prevent those ideas from finding fertile soil. And I think that as many people join the DA, and as they should, because the party cannot grow if people from opposing political views and political parties do not join its ranks. But how do you ensure that as a political party grows, those people who come to your political party, and bear in mind, they're not all coming to you because they now suddenly believe in your values. They're either disappointed or they find not much opportunity for advancement in their current home, but they're actually running away from something as opposed to running towards something. So how do you ensure that those new people who will ultimately, perhaps if you grow enough, will actually outnumber you? How do you ensure that you hold the line when a political party grows as exponentially as the DA has?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Gwen, and there's no kind of, as they say in Afrikaans, wen recept. There isn't just a kind of an algorithm or a menu or recipe that you can just put and say, well, this is how you do it and this is how you do it. I guess it really depends to a large extent on the disposition of the leadership of the party. Now, listen, I'm not a virgin in the brothel here. So I was a leader of the party for 13 years. You've got to make compromise, or you'll be leading a very narrow sector, as you inferred in your question. And I took quite a lot of controversial people on board, and, well, I did the deal between the Democratic Party and the National Party, which, the stain is still on the scutcheon of many people. But it was absolutely necessary. Take a decision, try and close down the fight in the opposition so you can advance and have the debate with the real people who matter, the ANC. We can spend all our time squabbling in the opposition corner of politics. And to some extent, for a long time, that prevailed. But, and we had to sometimes push the envelope or extend the line. And I remember once when a very controversial National Party politician from the Eastern Cape, who are not named tonight, joined us. Outrage. I had to address almost a protest meeting of the progs in the Rosebank Hotel. And the Financial Mail said the good thing about this doctor, as he was, National Party politician joining us, is he's an opportunist. But opportunists go where opportunities are. And when I read that sentence, I thought, so it's exactly right. Because he had a very good sense of political survival and where the wind was blowing. So I embraced him to our ranks. But at critical moments with him and others, we had to hold the line. And you could, have some flexibility, but you couldn't stray. So I think it is critical that the leadership cohort of the party actually know what the line is and how to hold it in a reasonably flexible way, which you have to be if you're heading a multi-cultural organization with people from different things. The other thing that is absolutely essential, and here I really sound like an ANC hack, but among my many I'm not, you've got to have political education. I mean, if people just wander in, everyone has to be welcome, but they have to be inducted into the values policy. Actually, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation used to be fantastic in helping us with workshops, and and the bigger the party grew, the greater the need for the workshops. I don't know, that still pertains today. Actually, what does it mean to be in a liberal Democrat party? What are these pillars? They're just abstractions. How do you make them meaningful for communities? Because, I don't think it helps to go around saying, I'm a liberal. Most people think it's not a great thing. It's how those principles are given expression, how they are communicated with a degree of empathy that's really going to turn the corner. But, you've got to know what the line is, or otherwise it's going to be crossed very, very frequently.
Hi, Tony. It's Khalid Kachalia here. I'd be very interested in what advice you might give to the DA in how it should perhaps balance the primacy of principle, which you've so eloquently spoken to today, with the primacy, if you like, of polling, which I believe the selective pandering to has driven the DA down a rather parlous path.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Look, we use polling a lot. Ryan is here tonight. He, introduced the science into the party. But we didn't use the poll to find out what we were standing for. We either used the poll to test a slogan or to see, where our support was in election and how a message was playing in a certain community. But I might be wrong about this. I cannot think ever once that we went and conducted a poll saying, what should we stand for? Or equally, we took a group of opinion polls and put them together and said, this is what we stand for. I'm obviously caricaturing. I'm not saying it's done at the moment. So I think polling is a science, and I think it's a necessary one in a modern political party, but it can only determine, confirm, or adjust or reject things that you already believe in.